Poor boy tells Billionaire, "Mom, it's me, I'm alive." Then something shocking happens. He was barefoot in the rain. That was the first thing Miriam noticed. A boy, maybe 13 years old, standing at the iron gates of her estate in the middle of a thunderstorm, soaking wet, his clothes hanging off him like they belonged to someone twice his size. No shoes. No jacket. His arms were wrapped around himself, not from the cold, but the way a person wraps their arms around themselves when they are trying to hold all their pieces together at the same time. She almost didn't stop. Her driver had already slowed down to let the gates swing open, and Miriam Solomon was a woman who had learned, through decades of being extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily alone, that strangers at your gate in the middle of the night were rarely what they appeared to be. She had a meeting in the morning. She had a glass of wine waiting. She had a life that had been arranged very carefully to keep certain kinds of pain at a distance. But the boy looked up. And the moment he looked up, the moment the headlights of her car caught his face full on through the rain, Miriam's hand shot forward and hit the partition glass between herself and her driver so hard that the sound cracked through the car like a gunshot. "Stop the car," she said. Her voice came out wrong, broken at the edges in a way she did not recognize from herself. "Ma'am, I said stop the car." The car stopped. She was out of it before her driver had even fully processed the instruction, standing in the rain in a $3,000 coat, not caring, not feeling anything except the roaring in her ears and the way the world had just tilted beneath her feet. Because the boy's face, his face, the jaw, the wide-set eyes, the particular shape of the brow and the way the mouth sat, not smiling, not crying, just watching her with an expression that was older than any 13-year-old face had any right to carry. She knew that face. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, the way she knew the sound of her own name. She had buried that face 4 years ago. She had stood at a tiny white casket in the rain and pressed her hand against the wood and whispered a name and felt something inside her close permanently, like a room that would never be opened again. "Ma'am, please get back in the car. The rain." "Elijah," she whispered. The boy's chin lifted. His wet hair was plastered flat against his forehead. His bare feet were black with mud from the road. He looked at her for one long second with those impossible familiar eyes, and then he opened his mouth and said the 4 words that stopped every clock in Miriam Solomon's world. "Mom, it's me. I'm alive." And what happened next? Nobody, not her driver, not her security team who came running from the gatehouse, not the lawyers, not the journalists, not even Miriam herself, nobody could have seen coming. But before we get there, drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. We have people joining us from all over the world, and every single comment means everything to us. And if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications because you do not want to miss where this story goes. Now let us go back to the beginning because to understand what happened at those gates, you have to understand what kind of woman Miriam Solomon was. And you have to understand what she lost. And you have to understand, most importantly, what she was willing to do to protect it. Miriam grew up with nothing. Not the kind of nothing that people say when they mean they grew up without luxuries. The real kind. The kind where you go to bed knowing that the silence in the kitchen means there is no food and nobody is going to say so out loud because saying it makes it more real. She grew up in a small town called Eber, 3 dusty streets and a market, and a church that was always full on Sundays because when you have nothing, you hold on to God with both hands. Her mother, a woman named Ruth, was the kind of woman who ironed her one good dress every Saturday evening and wore it like armor to church the next morning. Proud, quiet, immovable. Miriam had Ruth's eyes and her father's ambition. Her father, a man called Solomon Dyke, had left when she was 6 years old and sent money twice, and then stopped. She had not seen him since. But the ambition he left behind in her, that stayed. It was the only inheritance he gave her, and she used it like fuel. She studied through power cuts with a kerosene lamp. She won a scholarship at 15 that took her to a city school where all the other girls had more than her, and she let that gap carve her sharper instead of softer. She won another scholarship at 18 that took her out of the country entirely. She arrived in a cold northern city with one bag and a name nobody could pronounce correctly, and she decided that day that she would make the name mean something. She did. Miriam Solomon built her first company from a rented room and a laptop with a cracked screen. She made her first million at 27. She made her 100th at 34. By the time she was 40, her name was on buildings, on award podiums, on the lips of journalists who described her with words like formidable and visionary and self-made. She had learned to wear those words the way her mother wore that press dress. Like armor. Like proof. But underneath all of it, underneath the buildings and the awards and the armor, there was a room she kept locked. And in that room was a boy named Elijah. She had been 31 when she had him. His father was a man named Isaac Adeyemi, and the story of Isaac and Miriam was the kind of story that made perfect sense while it was happening, and made no sense at all once it was over. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, completely and dangerously, and with a skill that is almost indistinguishable from sincerity. He told her she was the only woman he had ever truly seen. He told her things in the dark that made her believe she had been wrong about love, that it was not the foolish thing her childhood had taught her it was, that it was real and it was hers and she deserved it. She believed him. She believed him through the early months, when the warmth was genuine and unguarded. She believed him through the year Elijah was born, that small screaming miracle she held in the delivery room while her whole body shook and something opened inside her that had never been opened before. She had not known she could love something this much. Had not known there was a room in her with this much space in it. Elijah. Her boy. Dark eyes and his father's jaw and her grandmother's hands, long-fingered, expressive, always reaching for something. She believed Isaac through the first year of Elijah's life because she was busy and tired, and because when you have built your entire adult existence on not needing anyone, admitting that something has gone wrong in your marriage feels like a defeat you cannot afford. She stopped believing him on a Tuesday afternoon when Elijah was 2 years old, and she came home early from a conference to find Isaac at the dining table with a woman Miriam did not know, and documents spread between them that she recognized immediately because she had spent 15 years learning to recognize documents exactly like them. Transfer papers. Financial instruments. Her signature on 3 of them, forged so well that it took her a moment to be certain. She stood in the doorway of her own dining room and looked at her husband and the strange woman and the papers, and she understood, in the way that you understand something you have been trying not to understand for a long time, that Isaac had not married her because he loved her. He had married her because she was going to be exactly this rich, and he had been patient enough to wait until the accounts were large enough to make it worth his while. She asked him to leave that evening. He went without a great deal of argument, which told her everything she had not wanted to know. The divorce was handled by attorneys on both sides, and was ugly in the way that divorces are ugly when one person realizes they were a means to an end. Isaac got considerably less than he had planned for. Miriam made sure of that. She was not a woman who lost things she had built. But Elijah she shared. Because whatever Isaac was, whatever he had done to her, she looked at her little boy and understood that the child was not the father, and the child deserved both of them if both of them were capable of showing up. She was generous in the custody arrangement. More generous than her lawyers advised. She did it because Elijah lit up when Isaac walked into the room, and she was not willing to be the reason that light went out. Elijah was 9 years old when Isaac took him on a trip. A weekend trip. 2 nights at a resort 3 hours from the city. Standard custody weekend. Nothing unusual. Miriam had packed Elijah's bag herself, the green one he loved, and she had tucked a small drawing inside it the way she always did, a lion, because Elijah had decided at age 5 that lions were the greatest animals in the world, and Miriam had gotten so practiced at drawing them that she could do a decent one in under a minute. She had kissed him at the door and said, "2 days, my lion," and he had said, "2 days, mama," with that gap-toothed smile that she could feel in her chest like a hand pressed flat over her heart. He did not come back in 2 days. On the second evening, her phone rang. It was a number she did not know. A woman's voice, calm, professional, detached in the way that people who deliver very bad news are trained to be detached so that the news does not destroy them too. There had been an accident. A road accident, mountain road, bad weather, The car had gone off the edge. She would need to come. She would need to come now. Isaac had survived with injuries. Her son. Her son had not. What happened in Miriam Solomon in the weeks after that phone call was not something that had words. She had built a life out of finding words for things, out of naming problems precisely, so they could be solved. There were no words for this. There was only the white casket and the rain and the sound her mother Ruth made when she arrived and saw Miriam's face and understood without being told, a sound that Miriam still heard sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking. There was only the way she placed her hand on the casket lid and could not move it. There was only the stone that formed in her chest afterward, heavy and permanent, the kind of stone that does not dissolve, only gets carried. She did not fall apart publicly. Miriam Solomon did not fall apart publicly. She went back to work after 2 weeks because the alternative was sitting in a house where every room had the shape of a boy in it, and she could not do that and survive. She worked. She built. She added floors to the buildings that had her name on them. She donated to children's hospitals with a size of check that made news and then instructed her publicist to keep her name out of the coverage because she was not doing it for praise. She did it because she needed somewhere to put the love that had nowhere to go. She did not visit the grave often. The first year, she went every week. Then, every month. Then she stopped because standing there made the stone in her chest heavier instead of lighter, and she had learned to carry the weight she had, not to add to it. She moved the small framed photograph of Elijah, the one from his 7th birthday, yellow cake on his nose, and that enormous ridiculous grin, from her desk at the office to her bedside table at home. This was the only public acknowledgement she allowed herself. That photograph in that specific place where she could see it last thing at night and first thing in the morning. For years she had lived like that. For years of the stone, and the photograph and the locked room inside her that she never opened. For years of building and working and being called formidable and not correcting anyone who thought that strength was the same thing as being fine. And then a barefoot boy appeared at her gate in the rain. Her security team reached him at the same moment she did. Large men, trained men, men who were paid considerable salaries to put themselves between Miriam Solomon and anything that could harm her. One of them had his hand on the boy's shoulder before Miriam got there. The boy did not flinch. He looked at the security guard's hand on his shoulder with a calm that seemed entirely wrong for a child in his situation, and then he looked past the guard at Miriam with those eyes. "Get your hands off him," Miriam said. Her head of security, a man named Tobias who had been with her for 8 years and had never once heard her use that voice with him, took a single step back. She was standing in front of the boy now. The rain was coming down hard. She could feel it soaking through her coat, but she was not thinking about her coat. She was looking at his face from 2 feet away instead of through the headlights, and up close it was even more impossible. The scar on his left temple. Thin, raised, curved like a crescent. She knew that scar. She had kissed that scar the morning he left with his green bag. He had gotten it at age 4, the corner of a coffee table, 3 stitches, and he had been more upset about missing dinner than about the stitching. Her hands were shaking. She did not shake. Miriam Solomon did not shake. Her hands were shaking. "Tell me your name," she said. Her voice was a whisper. It was the only volume available to her. The boy looked at her steadily. Up close his eyes were exhausted in a way that went beyond a single night without sleep. They were the eyes of someone who had been tired for a very long time and had kept going anyway. He had a bruise on his jaw that was 3 or 4 days old, yellowing at the edges. His wrists were thin. He needed a meal. He needed several meals. "My name is Elijah," he said. "Elijah Adeyemi Solomon. I was born on the 14th of March. My middle name is Daniel because you said Daniel in the Bible never gave up even when everything was against him, and you wanted that for me. I used to call the lion you drew me in my lunch bag, Little Leo. I was afraid of the drain in the bathtub until I was 6, and you never told anyone." The stone in Miriam's chest did something it had not done in 4 years. It cracked. Just slightly. Just at one edge. The way ice cracks before it breaks. "You have a small tattoo," the boy continued, and his voice was getting quieter now, as if he was running on reserves that were nearly empty. "On the inside of your right wrist. A word in your mother's handwriting. Persevere. You got it the year before I was born. You showed it to me when I was 7, and you said that when things are hard you look at it, and it reminds you that your mother's voice is still with you. Miriam's hand moved to her right wrist, without her permission. Her fingers pressed over the word, through the wet sleeve of her coat. I've been trying to find you, the boy said, and for the first time, the composure he had been carrying slipped, just at the edges, just slightly, the way the surface of water moves when something is pushing up from underneath. For 2 years. I have been trying to find you. For 2 years. And then, before Miriam could speak, before she could move, before she could do anything at all with the impossible enormous thing that was happening to her, the boy's legs gave out. He did not fall dramatically. He simply folded, the way a person folds when the last of the strength they have been rationing very carefully for a very long time finally runs out completely. He went down to his knees in the mud in front of her gates, and Miriam Solomon, Billionaire, board member, the woman journalists called a force of nature, went down with him without thinking about it once, both knees in the mud, her arms around a rain-soaked boy who might be her son, who had her son's face and her son's scar and her son's most private secrets, and she held him the way she had not held anything in 4 years, the way she had been afraid to hold anything in 4 years, because she was terrified that if she held on, she would feel how much she had missed it. She felt it. She felt all of it at once, like a wave she had been running from finally catching her, and she pressed her face against the top of his wet head, and she made a sound that she would later not remember making, but that Tobias and every member of her security team would never forget for the rest of their lives. Get the doctor, she said. Her voice was different now. Something had been stripped out of it. Something she had worn for 4 years. Get the doctor to the house right now. She picked the boy up. He was light. Too light. She carried him through the gates herself, past the security team, past her stunned driver, through the front door of the house that had been too large and too quiet for 4 years, and she brought him inside. And somewhere in the city, in a car moving carefully away from the neighborhood, a man named Isaac Adeyemi watched the gate close on his phone screen through the lens of a small camera he had paid someone to install in a tree 3 months ago when he first began to suspect that something he had arranged very thoroughly 4 years ago was coming undone. He watched the gate close. He put the phone down on the passenger seat, and his jaw tightened in the way that the jaw of a man tightens when he is not afraid yet but can feel the edge of afraid approaching, and he needs to decide, right now, tonight, what he's going to do before it arrives. He picked the phone back up and dialed a number. It rang once. We have a problem, he said. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. The doctor came within 20 minutes. His name was Dr. Emmanuel Osei, and he had been Miriam's private physician for 6 years. He was a quiet man, careful with words the way a good doctor is careful with a scalpel, using only what is necessary, and never more. He had seen Miriam Solomon through a bout of pneumonia she had refused to slow down for, through the weeks after Elijah's death, when she had stopped eating properly and would not admit it, and through a dozen smaller crises that never made the news because Miriam Solomon did not allow her crises to make the news. But when he walked into the guest room on the 2nd floor and saw the boy in the bed, he stopped. Just for a moment. Just one breath's worth of stopping. Then he set his bag down and got to work. Miriam stood in the corner of the room with her arms folded across her chest, not because she was cold, but because it was the only way she could keep herself from reaching out and touching the boy again. She was afraid that if she touched him again, she would not be able to think clearly. And she needed to think clearly. She needed to think more clearly right now than she had ever needed to think in her life. Dr. Osei checked the boy from head to toe with a thoroughness that Miriam was grateful for. He took his time. The boy lay still through all of it, watching the ceiling with those exhausted eyes, answering questions in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be for someone who had passed out in the mud 20 minutes ago. Mild dehydration. Malnutrition, not severe but significant. A healing cut on his right palm that had not been properly treated. Bruising along his ribs on the left side that made Dr. Osei's expression go very still and very careful in a way that made Miriam's own chest tighten. How did you get the bruising? Dr. Osei asked. The boy glanced at Miriam, then back at the doctor. I fell, he said. Dr. Osei wrote something in his notes and did not push. He finished the examination, wrote out instructions for Miriam's housekeeper about food and hydration and rest, gave the boy something for the pain, and then he walked to the corner of the room where Miriam was standing and he spoke to her in a low voice with his back to the boy. He needs rest and proper food for the next 48 hours. The ribs concern me. The bruising pattern is not consistent with a fall. He paused. He is consistent in his responses, his vital signs are stabilizing, and despite the physical state he is in, he is remarkably composed. Another pause. Miriam, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly. Ask it. Is it possible? She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. I buried my son 4 years ago, Emmanuel. I know. I saw the casket. I signed the paperwork. I stood at the grave. I know, he said again. Gently. But is it possible? She looked past him at the boy in the bed. The boy had turned his head on the pillow and was watching her. Just watching her. The way he had been watching her since the gate. With those eyes that had too much in them for someone his age. With a patience that felt earned rather than natural. The patience of someone who has been waiting a very long time and has learned that rushing changes nothing. Get the blood drawn tonight, she said quietly. I want a DNA panel. I want it processed as fast as money can make it happen. Dr. Osei nodded. I'll call the lab. Tell no one else. Not your receptionist. Not the lab technician's supervisor. No one. He nodded again and left the room. Miriam walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. The boy watched her do it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The house was quiet around them in the way that large houses are quiet at night, a deep, carpeted silence that swallowed small sounds whole. Are you in pain? She asked. I'm okay. That is not what I ask. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Something that recognized the precision of what she had said. A little, he said. The ribs. But it's not bad. Who hit you? He was quiet. You do not have to answer tonight, she said. But you will answer eventually. I know, he said. And the way he said it, without resentment, without defensiveness, just simply told her that he had been expecting this conversation. That he had been prepared for it. That this boy, whoever he was, had arrived at her gate tonight not by accident and not without a plan. Tell me, she said carefully, what you remember from before. He looked at the ceiling. He was quiet for a moment, and then he began to speak, and his voice was low and steady, and it moved through the room like something that had been held in for a very long time and was finally being allowed out. He remembered the apartment before the big house. The one with the yellow kitchen. He remembered that she used to sing in the mornings while she made tea, not real songs, just sounds, half melodies she invented. He remembered that she kept exactly 7 books on her nightstand and rotated them in a specific order, and it drove his father crazy. He remembered the smell of her coat when she came home from work in winter, cold air and something warm underneath it. He remembered little Leo, the drawn lion. He remembered the bathtub drain and the specific way she used to let the water out first before he stepped out so he would not see it and get afraid. He remembered the words she said to him every single night before he slept. Always the same words, the same order. Miriam's hands, folded in her lap, went perfectly still. Because nobody knew those words. They were not in any article. They were not something she had told anyone, not her mother, not her closest friend, not Emmanuel who knew nearly everything about her. They were words she had invented for a specific small person in a specific dark bedroom, and they had never been spoken anywhere else by anyone else in the world. She leaned forward. Say them, she said. Her voice barely made a sound. The boy turned his head on the pillow and looked at her directly. And he said them. Every word. The exact order. The small pause in the middle, where she always paused because Elijah had once told her he liked that part best, the pause because it meant she was thinking of him while she said it and not just reciting. The sound Miriam made was small. It was the sound of something that had been sealed shut for 4 years, opening 1 inch. Just 1 inch. She pressed her fist against her mouth and breathed through her nose and looked at this boy in the bed in her guest room, and her entire body was shaking now, not from cold, not from shock, but from the effort of holding herself at a careful distance from something she was desperate to run toward and was too afraid to. Because she had buried him. She had buried him. She had put her hand on the white casket in the rain. Elijah, she said. His name in her mouth felt like pressing on something that was both healed and not healed at all. I need you to tell me where you have been. I need you to tell me everything. He told her. Not all of it that night. That night he got through the first part, the part that started at the resort, the mountain road, the accident that she had been told about, and the part she had not been told about. He spoke slowly and without drama, and the lack of drama was what made it unbearable to listen to because it meant this was not a story to him. It was just what happened. It was just his life. The accident had been real. The car had gone off the road. That part was true. What was not true was that he had been in it. He had not been in it because 2 hours before the accident, his father had dropped him at a petrol station on the edge of the mountain road and told him to wait. He said he was going back for something he had forgotten at the resort. He said it would be 20 minutes. He said to stay in the back near the wall and not talk to anyone, and he would be back. He did not come back. Elijah had waited for 4 hours. He was 9 years old, alone at a petrol station on a mountain road, and he waited because his father told him to, and he trusted his father, because children trust their fathers. At some point a truck driver noticed him and asked if he was all right, and he said he was waiting for his dad, and the man waited with him for an hour, and then the police came. By the time the police came, the accident had already happened. By the time the accident had already happened, Miriam had already received the phone call. By the time Miriam had received the phone call, something had been put into motion that a 9-year-old boy at a petrol station did not know about and could not have stopped. He was taken by the police to a regional welfare office. He gave them his name. He told them about his mother. He told them everything. But the officer who took down his details, a young man who was tired and at the end of a long shift, wrote the name wrong. One letter, one transposed letter, and in the system he became someone else, a boy with a similar name and no traceable family, filed into the welfare system of a region 3 counties away from where Miriam Solomon's lawyers were searching for any trace of him. He was placed with a family, then another family, then a third. He tried to explain to every social worker, every welfare officer, every person in a position of authority who sat across from him with a clipboard, that his mother was Miriam Solomon and that she would be looking for him. He told them the name of her company. He told them her address. He told them her phone number, which he had memorized at age 6 because she had made it a game, a song with the numbers in it, because she always said a person should know how to reach home by heart. And every time, what happened was a variation of the same thing. The social workers were not unkind. They were overworked and under-resourced and managing more cases than any one person should manage, and when a 9-year-old child told them his mother was a famous billionaire and he had been lost in the system by a single transposed letter, the explanation that was easier to file and process was that the boy had an active imagination and a traumatic history and needed stability, not indulgence. He stopped telling them after a while. He was 11 by then, and he had learned what Miriam herself had once learned in a different kind of difficult life. That some walls you cannot break by talking. You have to find the door. He started looking for the door. The third family he was placed with was a couple in a mid-sized city. The husband was largely absent, and the wife was named Gloria, a hard-cornered woman who was not cruel exactly, but who had organized her home and her life around a rigid set of rules that had no room for a quiet, watchful, too intelligent boy who asked difficult questions. There were 2 other children in the house, both younger. Elijah watched out for them without being asked to. He cooked when Gloria forgot. He helped with homework. He made himself useful because he had understood from a young age that being useful was a form of being allowed to stay. But he never stopped looking. He used the computer at the school library. He searched for his own name and found nothing because the search had been closed. He searched for the accident and found the news reports. He found the memorial. He found the photographs of Miriam at the burial, that terrible photograph, the one that had been printed in 3 national newspapers, where she was standing at the graveside in a dark coat with her hand pressed flat against the casket lid and her face turned slightly away from the cameras, not hiding, just somewhere else entirely, somewhere so private and so broken that even the photographers who took the picture were reported to have felt like they had witnessed something they should not have. He found that photograph at 11 years old in a school library with 20 other children around him making noise and a teacher calling for quiet, and he sat very still in front of the screen, and he looked at his mother's face in that photograph for a long time. He told himself that she did not know. He had to keep telling himself that because the alternative was something he could not carry and keep going at the same time. She did not know. She thought he was gone. She was not looking anymore because she believed she had already lost him, and you cannot look for something you believe you have already buried. That was the thought that kept him moving. Not anger, not self-pity, just that one clear knowledge. She does not know. She needs to know. Get to her. It took him 2 more years. It took him stolen bus routes and wrong addresses and one night sleeping in a train station and the bruises on his ribs that he did not want to talk about yet, and a school librarian named Mrs. Abra who had a kind face and let him use the computer after hours without asking too many questions, and a social worker rotation that left a gap in supervision for exactly 3 weeks, and a determination that had been burning in him since he was 9 years old and had never once gone out. He arrived at her gate on a Thursday evening in November with no shoes, because he had given them to one of the younger children in the last house who had none, and that small detail, when Miriam learned it much later, would quietly finish her in a way that nothing else had managed to. Now he lay in her guest room with clean sheets and Dr. Osei's medication, and the first real meal he had eaten in 3 days sitting in his stomach, and he looked at her across the small space between the chair and the bed, and he said, "I knew you didn't know. I always knew you didn't know." And Miriam Solomon, who had survived poverty and betrayal and the collapse of her marriage and 4 years of grief that would have broken a lesser person entirely, put her face in her hands and cried in a way she had not cried since the casket in the rain. Not quietly, not with control. The real kind of crying. The kind that has been waiting 4 years behind a stone wall and has finally found the crack. The boy reached out his hand across the sheet. She took it. They stayed like that for a long time, and the house was quiet around them, and the clock on the wall moved forward the way clocks do, indifferent to miracles, indifferent to grief, marking out the seconds of a night that was changing everything. What neither of them knew was that 40 minutes away, in a restaurant in the city, Isaac Adeyemi was sitting across a table from a woman that Miriam had never met. The woman had sharp eyes and expensive shoes and the kind of face that showed you exactly what it wanted to show you and nothing more. Isaac had a glass of water in front of him that he had not touched. His phone was face down on the table. "He made it to her," he said. The woman looked at him. "I know. How is that possible? You told me." "I told you it was handled," she said. The same phrase. The same flat, controlled delivery. Clearly, it was not handled well enough. She picked up her glass. The question now is not how he got there. The question is what he told her, and what she is going to do about it. Isaac looked at the table. Something was moving behind his eyes that was not quite fear but was walking toward it. If she runs a DNA test. "She is already running a DNA test," the woman said simply. She ran at the moment she brought him inside. She is Miriam Solomon. That is what Miriam Solomon does. She set her glass down, which means we have perhaps 72 hours before the results confirm what she already believes. She looked at him steadily. "So, I am going to ask you once, Isaac, and I need you to answer me honestly. How many people know the truth about what happened on that mountain road?" The restaurant was warm and loud around them, glasses clinking, conversations overlapping. Normal life, continuing normally, the way it always does around the edges of things that are about to collapse. Isaac opened his mouth to answer, and his phone lit up on the table. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Just for 1 second, just one unguarded second before he flipped it back over. But the woman across the table had seen it, and her eyes had sharpened and her hand had tightened around her glass, and she said very quietly, "Who was that?" Isaac did not answer. "Isaac." Her voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "Who just messaged you?" And he looked at her across the table, and in his face was something she had not expected to see there. Something that looked almost like relief. And something that looked almost like guilt. And something that looked very much like a man who has been keeping a secret inside a secret and is not sure, now that the first one is unraveling, whether the second one will hold. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. The message on Isaac's phone was 4 words. Just 4 words from a number that had no name attached to it, a number he had saved under nothing, a number that existed in his phone the way certain things exist in a person's life, quietly, invisibly, in a place you hope nobody ever looks. The 4 words were, "She talked to someone." He turned the phone face down again, but the woman across the table, whose name was Constance Abori, had the eyes of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where people tried to hide things and had never once missed anything. She had seen the change in his face in the half-second before he covered the screen. She had cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. Filed it. Processed it. Drew a conclusion that she did not share out loud because Constance Abori never shared conclusions out loud until she was ready to use them. "Finish your water," she said. "And then you're going to tell me everything. Not the version you prepared. Everything." Isaac picked up the water glass. His hand was steady. He had always had steady hands. It was one of the things that had served him well in life, the appearance of calm even when the inside of him was doing something completely different. He drank. He set the glass down. He looked at Constance and he made a decision that he would later understand was the first honest decision he had made in a very long time. "There is someone else who knows," he said. Constance did not move. "Who?" "A man named Philip Ease. He was the welfare officer who processed Elijah's initial intake. The one who wrote down the wrong name." Isaac looked at the table. It was not an accident. The restaurant noise continued around them. Someone at the next table laughed at something. A waiter moved past with a tray of glasses that caught the light. Constance was very still. "You paid him to mislabel the file." It was not a question. Isaac said nothing, which was its own answer. "And this Philip Ease," Constance said carefully, "has now contacted you. He saw the news last year. The anniversary coverage of the accident. My photograph was in one of the articles." Isaac's jaw tightened. He has been careful. Small amounts. Irregular enough that it looked like normal expenses. But he sent that message 20 minutes ago, which means he knows the boy made it to Miriam. Constance looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was neither anger nor surprise. It was the expression of someone solving an equation. Adding a new variable. Recalculating. She reached into her bag and placed a small amount of cash on the table for the drinks, exact to the last coin, and she stood up. "Do nothing tonight," she said. "Do not contact Philip Ease. Do not go near Miriam's estate. Do not call anyone." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair and put it on with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided exactly what needed to happen next and was simply preparing to go and make it happen. "And Isaac." She looked at him. "The next time your phone receives a message in this kind of meeting, you will show it to me immediately. We do not have room for half-truths anymore." She walked out of the restaurant, and she did not look back. Isaac sat alone at the table with his empty water glass and his face-down phone, and the specific cold weight of a man who has built a structure of lies so carefully for so long that he had started to believe the structure was stable, and is now sitting in the rubble of understanding that no structure built on lies is ever stable. It is only a matter of what shifts first. He picked up his phone. He looked at the message again. She talked to someone. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened a different conversation. An older one. And he read back through it the way you read back through something when you are trying to find the exact moment things went wrong. And as he read, his face did something that the restaurant light caught clearly. Something that was not the calculated expression of a man managing a crisis. Something underneath that. Something that had been underneath for a long time and that he had been very skilled at keeping there. Something that looked, in the most private and unguarded corner of it, like grief. Upstairs in the guest room, Elijah had fallen asleep. He had gone under quickly, the way bodies go under when they have been running on adrenaline for too long and finally find something safe enough to let go in. One moment he was talking, the next his eyes were closed and his breathing had deepened and his hand in Miriam's had gone slack. She did not let go immediately. She sat in the chair beside his bed for another 40 minutes, holding his hand lightly, watching his face in sleep. In sleep, the careful composure he carried dissolved, and he looked his age. 13 years old. A child. Her child, possibly, probably. She knew it in the part of her that existed below evidence, and above doubt, the part that had recognized his face through the headlights before her brain had finished forming the thought. She studied him the way she had studied spreadsheets and investment portfolios and the faces of people across negotiating tables. Looking for information. Looking for truth. The scar on his temple was the right scar in the right place. The hands were her grandmother's hands. The particular way his brow sat, even in sleep, slightly furrowed, slightly serious, was a thing she remembered from 1,000 mornings of watching him sleep in his own bed in a house that felt entirely different now from how it had felt this morning. She finally let go of his hand and placed it gently on the sheet and stood up. She went to the window. The city was spread out below, lit and moving indifferent. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and she thought. The way she thought through large problems, systematically, from the outside in. What did she know? What did she not know? What needed to happen in what order? She knew that the DNA results would take 48 hours minimum, even with every resource she could throw at accelerating them. She knew that she believed this boy. She knew the difference between believing something and being able to prove it, and she knew that what she believed and what she could prove needed to end up in the same place before she could do what she was going to do. And what she was going to do, she already knew. She had known since the moment he said the bedtime words. She was going to find out exactly what had happened on that mountain road 4 years ago. She was going to find out who had done it and how and why. And she was going to take everything they had built in the time they believed she was broken, and she was going to dismantle it so completely and so thoroughly that no amount of money or silence or clever paperwork would leave them anywhere to stand. She had built a billion-dollar company from a rented room and a cracked laptop. She had done it without anyone's help and against obstacles that would have stopped most people 3 times over. This was not going to be different. She went to her own room, sat at the desk, and opened her laptop. She began with Philip Ease's name because she had caught it in Elijah's account of the welfare office, and she had filed it the way she filed everything that might be useful later, automatically, precisely, in the correct drawer of her mind. She searched carefully and methodically, and within an hour she had a shape. A welfare officer in the regional system. His record was unremarkable except for 2 things that Miriam's trained eye picked out from the documents she was able to access. A property purchase 4 months after the accident that was inconsistent with a welfare officer's salary, and a transfer out of the region 6 weeks later that moved him 3 counties away from where he had processed the initial paperwork. She sat back. She picked up her phone and called a number. It rang 4 times before a woman answered, sleep-roughened but alert immediately, because the woman on the other end of this call had been working for Miriam Solomon for 9 years, and she knew that a call at this hour meant something had broken, and Miriam needed her now. "Rebecca," Miriam said. "I need you. Tonight." Rebecca Mensah was 38 years old and had the kind of mind that sorted through complex information the way other people sorted through cutlery. Quick, automatic, never confused about what belonged where. She was Miriam's head of operations and her most trusted person in any room, and she arrived at the estate 40 minutes later in a dark coat with a laptop bag over her shoulder and eyes that were fully awake despite the hour. Miriam met her in the study. She closed the door. She told Rebecca everything. She watched Rebecca's face as she listened. Rebecca had a very controlled face. You had to know her well to read it. Miriam knew her well enough to see the exact moment when controlled moved to something else. Something tight and bright and quietly furious. When Miriam finished, Rebecca put her laptop on the desk and said, "What do you need?" "Philip Ease." "Everything." Quietly. Miriam sat across from her. "Financial records. Movement records. Any contact he has had in the past 4 years with anyone connected to Isaac. I want the shape of what was done. I want names. I want paper." Rebecca was already typing. "And Isaac." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Outside the window the city, lights blurred slightly in the early morning fog. She thought about Isaac. She thought about the man she had believed she knew, the man who had held her hand in the delivery room when Elijah came into the world, who had cried real tears, she was certain they were real, who had looked at their son with something that appeared in every way to be love. She thought about the 9 years of their life together, and the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the moment Elijah started telling her what happened on that mountain road. Not the legal question. Not the evidentiary question. The human one. Did he love Elijah? Did he love him and still do this? Or had the love been another thing he performed? She did not know which answer was worse. Isaac later, she said. Philip ease first. Build me the foundation before we touch the walls. Rebecca nodded and worked, and Miriam sat across from her and did not sleep. At 4 a.m, Miriam went back to check on Elijah. She stood in the doorway of the guest room and listened to him breathing in the dark. Then she went back to the study. At 5:30, Rebecca looked up from her screen and said, I found the property. I found the transfer payment. And I found something else. Miriam leaned forward. The payment did not come from Isaac directly, Rebecca said. She turned the laptop so Miriam could see the screen. It came through a company. A shell company registered in a name that took me an hour to trace back. She looked at Miriam with an expression that had gone past careful into something approaching disbelief. Miriam. The company is registered to Constance Ibori. The name landed in the room and sat there. Constance Ibori was not a name from the background. She was not a person who existed in the shadows. She was a name that appeared in boardrooms and on charity gala guest lists and in the society pages of magazines that cover the movements of people with significant money and significant influence. She was 61 years old, and she had built a financial consulting empire that managed the portfolios of some of the wealthiest families in the country. She sat on 3 nonprofit boards. She gave keynote speeches about integrity in business. She had been profiled twice in national publications with photographs that showed a woman of complete and polished authority. She was also, Miriam realized with a cold that moved through her from the outside in a woman she had met. 3 times at least. Twice at events, once at a dinner where Constance had been charming and sharp and had said something about Miriam's recent acquisition that showed she had read about it in detail. Miriam had been flattered, slightly. The attention of a woman like Constance, precise and evaluating, had felt like a form of respect. She sat very still. What is her connection to Isaac? She asked. Her voice had gone to the quiet, controlled place it went when the emotion was large, and she needed to keep it behind the wall for now. That is the part that took me longest. Rebecca paused. They are not publicly connected. There is no record of a professional relationship, no shared board positions, no co-signed documents. But there is a photograph. She turned the laptop again. From 11 years ago. A private event. A small gathering at a property in the hills outside the city. Security camera image, low quality. She pointed at the screen. That is Isaac. And that woman beside him is a decade younger, and her hair is different, but the bone structure is identical. She looked at Miriam. I believe Constance Ibori is not a stranger who got drawn into this. I believe she has been in it from the beginning. Before the marriage. Before Elijah. Miriam looked at the photograph for a very long time. 11 years ago, she had just started her second company. She had been brilliant and driven and moving so fast that the people around her had been reduced to blurs. She had met Isaac at a conference. He had been in the 3rd row of her keynote audience, and he had found her afterward at the reception and said something clever that made her laugh. She had not laughed easily in those years, and the laugh had startled her. She had thought it was fate. She understood now what it had been. It had been a room that someone had arranged, a conference that someone had ensured Isaac attended, a keynote that someone had placed him 3 rows from the front of, a reception that someone had calculated she would attend, and a clever thing that a charming man had said to a woman who was brilliant at business and had never quite learned to be careful about love. 11 years. They had been watching her for 11 years. The cold in her chest became something else. It became a heat, slow and absolute, the kind of heat that does not flare and die but builds steadily from a base, and does not stop. Not rage. Rage was loud and unpredictable, and made you sloppy. This was something more dangerous than rage. This was Miriam Solomon understanding the full size and shape of what had been done to her and to her son, and making a decision in the quiet part of herself where all her real decisions were made. She stood up. Rebecca. Her voice was completely level. "I need you to find Philip Ease's current address. And then I need you to call Daniel Achebe." Daniel Achebe was her attorney. He was 70 years old and had practiced law for 45 of them, and there was not a legal instrument in existence that he did not know how to use as precisely as a surgeon used a knife. "Tell him to come here. This morning. Tell him to bring everything he needs for a fraud case, a criminal conspiracy case, and a child endangerment case, because we are going to be building all three." Rebecca had already picked up her phone. "And Rebecca." Miriam stopped at the doorway. "Find out if Constance Abori is on any boards or committees connected to child welfare or foster care administration." She looked at the window where the first pale light of morning was beginning to appear at the edges of the dark. "Because I need to understand how deep this goes. I need to understand if my son was the only child placed into a system that someone was using as a mechanism. Or if there were others." Rebecca looked up from her phone. In 9 years of working for this woman, she had seen Miriam Solomon walk into boardrooms and courtrooms and the most difficult conversations that money and power produce. She had seen her negotiate and dismantle and rebuild. But she had never heard her voice sound like this. This quiet. This certain. This particular quality of absolute stillness that was not the stillness of someone who had accepted something, but the stillness of something that has chosen its direction and is already moving. "I'll find it," Rebecca said. Miriam went upstairs. She went back to the guest room doorway and stood there in the early morning half-light and looked at the boy sleeping in the bed. His face was peaceful. His breathing was even. One hand was open on the pillow beside his face, the long-fingered hand that looked like her grandmother's. He had kicked the blanket slightly off his feet in his sleep, and she crossed to the bed without making a sound and pulled the blanket back over him the way she had done 10,000 times in a different life, carefully, not wanting to wake him. He stirred slightly. His eyes did not open, but his hand moved and found hers where it rested on the edge of the bed, and his fingers closed around 2 of hers loosely, the automatic unconscious reach of a child for a parent, the body knowing what the sleeping mind does not need to confirm. She stood very still. Downstairs, the front doorbell rang. She heard Tobias cross the entry hall. She heard voices, low, and then Tobias's footsteps coming up the stairs. He knocked on the doorframe very softly, and when she turned he had an expression that was not quite alarm but was the thing that comes before alarm in a careful man. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "There is a woman at the door. She says her name is Constance Abori." He paused. "She says she is here about the boy." Miriam looked at him. Then she looked back at her son's sleeping face. Then she gently freed her fingers from his and straightened up to her full height, and something moved through her expression that made Tobias, 8-year veteran of personal security for difficult and powerful people, take one involuntary half-step back. "Tell her," Miriam said, quietly and clearly, "to wait. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth." Constance Abori had never waited for anything in her life. She had arranged things so that waiting was never necessary. Rooms were ready before she arrived. People were prepared before she spoke. Problems were solved before they became visible. This was not luck or coincidence. It was the result of 40 years of meticulous, patient, invisible work. She had built her entire existence on being 3 steps ahead of every situation she entered, and she had never once, in 40 years, found herself standing on the wrong side of a door. Until now. She stood in the entry hall of Miriam Solomon's estate in a cream coat and dark gloves, and she waited. Tobias had offered her a seat with the professional courtesy of a man doing his job, and she had declined because sitting would have meant settling, and settling would have meant something she was not prepared to show. So she stood. And she looked at the entry hall with its high ceiling and its warm light and the large framed photograph on the wall, a woman and a small boy on a garden floor, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, and she looked at that photograph for a long time with an expression that nobody was in the room to read. Upstairs, Miriam was not making her wait out of uncertainty. She was making her wait because every minute Constance stood in that entry hall was a minute that Daniel Achebe needed to park his car and walk through the side entrance that Miriam had told Rebecca to leave open. She needed her attorney in the house before she opened the sitting room door. She needed the architecture of what was about to happen to be correct before it began, because she was not going to get a second chance at this, and she knew it. She heard Daniel's footsteps on the back stairs. She met him in the upstairs corridor. He was 70 years old and had driven to her house at 6 in the morning, and he looked completely unruffled, briefcase in hand, reading glasses already on, because Daniel Achebe had been doing this for 45 years, and unruffled was simply his resting state. She told him in 4 minutes. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Is the boy awake?" "Not yet." "Good. Let him sleep." He looked at her over his glasses. "And this woman downstairs. You are certain?" Rebecca traced the shell company to her directly. The payment to Philip Ease for mislabeling Elijah's file came from an account she controls. Miriam's voice was steady and precise. "And Isaac did not meet me by accident. I believe she arranged the entire approach. The conference, the introduction, everything." Daniel was quiet for a moment. In 45 years, he had heard a great many things in his professional capacity. He had learned not to react to information before he had finished receiving it. But something moved in his expression. Something that was not quite anger, but was in the same building. "Then we are not dealing with a domestic dispute or a custody matter," he said. "We are dealing with a conspiracy that was constructed before the marriage, executed during it, and maintained for 4 years after it. That is a criminal matter on several levels simultaneously." "I know what it is," Miriam said. "I need you in the room when I speak to her." "I will be in the room." He glanced toward the guest room door. "And Miriam, whatever she says when you confront her, whatever explanation she offers, whatever version of events she constructs, do not let her see that it affects you. The moment she believes she can reach you emotionally, she will use it." Miriam looked at him. "I have been doing business with people who want things from me for 20 years, Daniel." "I know," he said, "but this is not business." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the stairs. Constance heard the footsteps coming down, and she arranged her face the way she always arranged it before a difficult meeting. Open. Measured. The face of a woman who has come to help. She had constructed her story on the drive over, and it was a good story. It acknowledged proximity to Isaac without acknowledging direction of him. It suggested concern for the boy's welfare. It positioned her as someone who had learned troubling things about Isaac's actions and had come, out of conscience, to share them. It was the kind of story that was almost impossible to disprove quickly, and that bought time, which was the only currency that mattered right now. She heard 2 sets of footsteps. She adjusted. 2 people. Miriam had someone with her. That was manageable. Miriam came around the bottom of the stairs and into the entry hall, and Constance looked at her and understood immediately, in the first half-second before either of them spoke, that something had gone wrong with the timing. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. Because Miriam Solomon's face was not the face of a woman who had spent the night in shock and confusion and desperate hope. It was not soft with emotion or clouded with the exhausting uncertainty of a mother who did not yet know what to believe. It was clear. It was still. It was the specific stillness of someone who already knows. Constance had 1 second to decide whether to retreat or advance. She advanced. "Miriam," she said warmly, stepping forward with her hand extended. "I am so sorry to come at this hour. I know this must be an incredibly overwhelming time, and I want you to know that I am here as a friend. I have some information about Isaac that I think you need to hear before." Constance. Miriam said her name once. Just her name. The way you place an object on a table. Not hard. Just exactly there. Constance stopped. The man beside Miriam stepped forward slightly and extended a business card between 2 fingers. Constance looked at it. She looked at the name on it. Daniel Achebe. She knew the name. Everyone in their world knew the name. The story she had constructed on the drive over shifted in her mind like sand shifting under a wave. She rebuilt it in real time. Faster. Smaller. More defensive. "Come in," Miriam said. And she turned and walked toward the sitting room, and her voice left no room for anything except following. They sat in the small warm sitting room, the book-lined one, the private one. Miriam and Daniel on one side. Constance across from them. The fire had burned down to embers, and nobody moved to add wood to it. The morning light was coming through the curtains now, pale and thin, and it fell across the coffee table between them and made everything look very clear and very exposed. Constance began speaking. She was extraordinary at it. Even Miriam, who was listening with every defensive sense fully deployed, recognized the craftsmanship, the concern for Elijah's well-being, the careful distance from Isaac's decisions, the suggestion of her own discomfort with things she had learned, framed always as things she had learned, never things she had arranged. She was building the second victim story brick by brick, and each brick was plausible and smooth and fit neatly against the next. She spoke for 4 minutes. Then Miriam said 2 words. Philip ease. Constance's hands, folded in her lap, moved. Just slightly. Just the fingers of the right hand pressing harder into the back of the left for 1 moment before releasing. If you were not watching for it, you would miss it completely. Miriam had been watching for it. I'm sorry, Constance said. Philip ease, Miriam said again. Same tone. Same placement. He was the welfare officer who processed my son's intake paperwork 4 years ago. He wrote the wrong name in the file. 1 transposed letter. It resulted in my son being unlocatable in the system for 4 years. She paused. The payment that compensated him for that error came from a shell company registered to an account you control. She looked at Constance without blinking. I have the bank records. I have the company registration. I have the transfer documentation. Rebecca pulled it in under 3 hours, which tells me it was not hidden as carefully as you believed it was. The room was completely quiet. Constance sat across from them, and her face went through something in those seconds that it had probably not gone through in public in a very long time. Not fear exactly. Constance Ibori was too seasoned for visible fear. But the performance stopped. The warmth stopped. The careful construction of a woman who had come out of concern and conscience simply ceased, as if a switch had been turned off. And what was underneath was not monstrous. That would almost have been easier. What was underneath was something colder and more exhausting than that. A person who had made a calculation a very long time ago and had spent every day since maintaining it, and was now sitting in the moment where the maintenance had finally failed. You should speak with your attorney, Daniel said. His voice was even and professional and final. Constance looked at him. She looked at Miriam. Something passed across her face that was too quick to name, and then she straightened in her chair, and she said nothing. She pressed her lips together, and she said absolutely nothing, and in that silence, she made her own decision. Daniel's phone was already at his ear. What followed in the weeks after that morning moved the way justice moves when it has both the truth and significant resources behind it. Faster than the guilty expect and slower than the innocent can bear, but in one direction, and without stopping. Philip Ease was located at his current address by investigators before the end of that same day. He was a man who had spent 4 years sleeping badly and starting at unexpected sounds, and who opened his door to the investigators with the expression of someone who had been anticipating this knock for so long that its arrival was almost a relief. He sat down with the district attorney's office the following morning and talked for 6 hours and signed every page they put in front of him. Isaac was arrested on a Thursday. He did not fight the investigators at his door. He let them in. He sat at his own kitchen table and he looked at the arrest warrant with an expression that Tobias, who was present as part of Miriam's security coordination, would later describe as someone finally putting down something very heavy that they had been carrying for a very long time. He asked only one question before they took him. He asked if Elijah was all right. The investigator looked at him for a moment. He is with his mother, she said. Isaac closed his eyes. He nodded once. And he stood up and went with them quietly. Constance fought. She hired the most expensive legal team available, and she used every instrument they had, and she was formidable in the way that people who have spent their lives building careful structures are formidable when those structures begin to fall. She contested every document. She challenged the chain of evidence. She constructed alternative explanations for the shell company, for the payment, for her presence at Isaac's side 11 years ago in a photograph from a private event. It was not enough. June Carver had been Vanessa's undoing in 2 words. Philip Ease was Constance's. His testimony was detailed, consistent, and corroborated by the financial records at every point.
He remembered dates.
He remembered instructions. He remembered the specific phrase he had been told to use in the paperwork, so it would pass a casual audit and fail a thorough one. He remembered the woman who had given him those instructions on a phone call he had taken in his car in a car park 11 years ago before any of this had happened, because Constance had planned for contingencies even then. He remembered her voice. He had recorded that phone call. He had recorded it on a small device he kept in his car because he was a man who had understood from the moment he agreed to what he agreed to that he was not the kind of person who would be protected if things went wrong. He was the expendable part. He had known it, and he had been afraid, and he had pressed record and kept the file in a place that had taken investigators 4 days to find and had taken them less than an hour to verify. Constance Ibori was convicted on charges that included criminal conspiracy, fraud, child endangerment, and 4 additional counts that accumulated as the investigation widened, and the full shape of what she had arranged became visible not just in this case, but in 2 previous ones that had gone uninvestigated because the victims had no Miriam Solomon in their corner. She was sentenced to 22 years. Isaac pled guilty. He received a lesser sentence in exchange for his full cooperation. On the day he entered the courthouse for his sentencing hearing, he passed within 20 feet of where Miriam was standing in the corridor with Daniel Achebe and Rebecca.
He stopped.
The officers with him allowed the pause. He looked at Miriam, and the look on his face was not the face she expected, not the calculated face she had watched for 9 years, but something stripped entirely of calculation. Something raw and ruined and real. He looked past her for a moment. His voice was very low. "Is he doing all right? In school, is he?" "He is doing more than all right," Miriam said. Her voice was even. "He is extraordinary. He has always been extraordinary." Something moved in Isaac's face. He nodded once. His eyes went bright for one moment, and then he pressed his lips together and looked away and walked forward with the officers and did not look back. Miriam watched him go. She stood very still. And then she breathed out, long and slow, and she turned and walked in the opposite direction.
The house changed.
Not the building. The same rooms, the same view, the same city spread out beyond the kitchen window in the mornings. But the life inside it expanded and warmed and filled with sound in a way it had not in 4 years. In a way, honestly, that it had never fully been, because before there had been the marriage and the performance and the careful maintenance of a life that was built on something false underneath. Now there was just the truth. Quiet, imperfect, still carrying the weight of what had happened, but true. Elijah enrolled in a school nearby with a library that he loved immediately and a science teacher named Mr. Obiora who recognized within 2 weeks that the boy had a mind that needed to be challenged rather than simply filled. He was behind in some areas after 4 years of disrupted education and ahead in others by a distance that surprised his teachers. He read constantly. He asked questions that made adults pause before answering. He found a therapist he trusted, a man named Dr. Samuel Kalu who had an office near the park and kept a bowl of sweets on his desk that he never commented on and never removed. Elijah went twice a week and worked through 4 years of being unnamed and movable and reduced to a file with the wrong letter in it with the same methodical patience he had applied to finding his mother. It took time. Some mornings were harder than others. Some nights he woke in the dark in a warm, safe room and needed a moment to remember where he was and that he was allowed to stay. On those nights, Miriam was always awake. She did not sleep deeply anymore. Some part of her stayed surface closed to consciousness, some maternal instinct that had been dormant for 4 years and had switched back on at the gate in the rain and never fully switched off again. She would hear him and she would come to his doorway and she would not make a production of it. Just stand there until he saw her and nodded, and she would nod back, and sometimes she would come in and sit in the chair by the bed, and sometimes just her being in the doorway was enough. They built things slowly. They built a language between them that was partly the old one, the one from before, the bedtime words and little Leo and the memory of a yellow kitchen and half-invented morning melodies, and partly something new. Something that belonged specifically to who they each were now, to what they had each carried and survived and brought to this house. She taught him to read financial documents over breakfast on Saturday mornings because she had decided early that the best gift she could give him was the ability to understand exactly how the world moved money around and where the cracks were. He taught her to play a card game he had learned in one of the group homes that she was terrible at for 6 straight weeks and then won 3 times in a row, at which point he looked at her across the table with suspicious narrowed eyes and said, "You were letting me win before." And she said, "I was learning." And he said, "That is the most you thing I have ever heard." And they both laughed until the housekeeper came in to ask if everything was all right. On a Saturday morning in March, 7 months after the night at the gate, Miriam came downstairs to find Elijah already at the kitchen island with a notebook open in front of him and a pen in his hand, and his grandmother's long fingers moving carefully across the page. He was writing a list. She poured herself tea and sat across from him. "What is that?" He looked up. His face in the morning light was open and young and serious all at the same time, the particular combination that had always been specifically his. "I want to build something," he said. "An organization. For kids in the welfare system who get lost in the paperwork. Kids whose files get wrong names or wrong counties or wrong ages. Kids who fall into the gaps." He looked at the notebook. "Because I know what it is like to be in the gap. And I know what it is like when nobody is looking at the paperwork closely enough." Miriam was quiet for a moment. She looked at her son. She thought about a woman named Stella Cole whom she had never met but whose story had some of the same shape as this one, the same stubborn refusal to stay invisible, the same long patience, the same understanding that information is the weapon of people who have nothing else. She thought about how many children there were in the world who had nobody running a database search at 3 in the morning on their behalf. "How do you want to run it?" she asked. He looked at her. Something brightened in his face. "You are not going to tell me I am too young? You navigated 4 years in the child welfare system alone, tracked your own mother down across 3 counties, and arrived at my gate with a plan," she said. "You are not too young. You are probably better qualified than most adults." She picked up her tea. "How do you want to run it?" He turned the notebook around so she could read it. She read it. She read it carefully. She asked 2 questions. He answered both of them precisely and without hesitation. She read it again. Then she said, "You need a name." He had already written it at the top of the page. She had not seen it because he had covered it with his hand while she read.
He lifted his hand now.
"The Daniel Foundation," it said, in careful block letters. Daniel, the name she had given him in the middle name, because she believed in a man who kept going when everything was against him. The name she had said in the dark of a delivery room to a small person she was promising the world to. Miriam set her tea down. She pressed both hands flat on the counter, and she breathed through what moved through her chest at the sight of that name in his handwriting. Breathed through it, and held it, and let it be what it was. Then she looked up at her son. "I will draw up the paperwork," she said. He smiled. Not the careful, measured smile of a boy who had learned to be cautious with warmth. The real one. Wide and unguarded, and exactly the smile from the photograph on her bedside table, yellow cake and gap teeth, and a joy that did not calculate the risk of being seen. That smile. After 4 years. In her kitchen. On a Saturday morning in March with the tea still warm and the notebook between them and the city waking up outside the window. She reached across the island and covered his hand with hers, and he let her, and they stayed like that for a moment in the ordinary, irreplaceable miracle of being exactly where they were supposed to be. Outside the window, the morning light was coming in clean and clear, and the city was moving and alive, and in the sitting room down the hall the photograph on the wall showed a woman and a small boy on a garden floor, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. That is where we leave them. Not at the worst of it, and not at the beginning of it, but here. At a kitchen island on a Saturday morning. At a notebook with a name at the top written in a child's careful hand. At the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a mother and her son on the right side of everything they almost lost. Because some stories do not end with fireworks or courtroom speeches or dramatic final moments. Some of the best ones end quietly. At a kitchen table. with tea going cold, and a plan being made, and two people who found their way back to each other against every odd that existed, looking at each other across a small, ordinary distance, and simply being there. Still here. Both of them still here. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth.